Okay, so welcome everybody, if you can all hear me, to today's session of the Expert Talk Series. We're delighted to welcome Professor Michael Jacobson, who has kindly agreed to give us a presentation today, and to Dr. Daphne Gondelacker, who has kindly agreed to step in and moderate. So I'm just going to give a quick welcome to everybody. Thank you so much for joining. We have quite a few in the audience today, which is fantastic for a Friday. Really appreciate everyone coming to see the presentation. And I'm just going to give a quick introduction and then we'll leave the floor to you, Professor. Is that okay with everybody?
Yes.
Okay, so just to begin, Dr. Michael Jacobson is a professor of forest resources in the Department of Ecosystem Science and Management at Penn State. He teaches courses in forest economics and finance, global agriculture systems, agroforestry, and international forestry. Dr. Jacobson has worked on agroforestry systems for almost 40 years and is currently collaborating with Cabby Publishing on a book project addressing traditional dryland agroforestry systems. He is currently leading 2 international projects funded by the Belmont Forum and the National Science Foundation, focusing respectively on drought and disaster risk resilience indicators and on water, energy, food nexus networking. So very topical for us. And Dr. Daphne Gondelacker, who is moderating, is a professor at the Chair of Urban Water Systems Engineering at the School of Engineering and Design at the Technical University of Munich in Germany. Her research focus is integrated urban planning, the water, energy, food ecosystems nexus, and multi-stakeholder participatory co-creation processes in Africa and Asia. She holds a PhD in ecosystem studies from the University of Tokyo and a master's and bachelor's in architecture and urban planning. Prior to joining TUM, she worked as a postdoctoral associate at the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the US and the Center for Development Research at the University of Bonn in Germany. So delighted to welcome the pair of them. So yeah, if you just want to introduce yourselves a little bit and say hello, and then we'll leave the floor to you, Professor Jacobson.
Thank you very much, Leah. I will just say that thank you very much, Professor Jacobson, for joining us today and for giving us your expert insights. We're very much looking forward to your talk. And thank you, Leah, for the kind introductions.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to share my screen and put it on slideshow. Okay. Perfect. Should be good to go. Thank you very much, Abel. Thanks very much to the TRANS-SAHARA Project colleagues for inviting me. It's a pleasure to give my thinking on this topic. I don't know what happened there, but all right. So it was fascinating for me to see this project because I've been working on agroforestry, as Leah mentioned, for a long time, and also water, energy, food nexus since about 2018. So I feel like I can provide some insights of my thinking. And I'm currently on sabbatical in Morocco, and I've been here about 6 months so far till the end of May. And I started working on Oregon and oasis systems, and I thought, well, why not look at traditional dryland agroforestry systems, which they are, and try and tell a story about why I think they neglected. So that's why that's in the title. Then I thought, okay, I'll try and link it to Nexus, the whole issue of agroforestry. So that's sort of the aim of my talk. And just to be more specific, I want to tell you why I'm focusing on the traditional dryland systems. I want to give you some thinking about what I think is the state of agroforestry in general these days, and how can agroforestry link to WEF Nexus. And then finally, I like to just tell you what the bottom line, which is that I think we should be empowering the farmers. They know the most about their land, and we should give them more ways to manage their land with us. And so I call them reliability professionals. So just to set the stage here, I'm trying to just get rid of this. I don't know why it won't. Okay, so basically, this is how I like to think of agroforestry. You all know what the definition is, the integration of trees, crops, and livestock. And I like this idea of intensification and diversity. And you can see on the left where we have sort of monocultures of pastures, crops, and trees. On the right, we have sort of the natural systems. And in the middle, we have these mixed crop livestock agroforestry systems. So we go from intensification through maybe chemicals as one way to create those monocultures versus going towards the right where we have more diversification. So that's one of the themes, I think, in traditional systems is the diversification. Now, we're in the traditional dryland agroforestry systems, it's basically just trees on farms. And, you know, I'll get to the science of agroforestry, which emerged in the 70s, but I look at trees on farms as agroforestry. And here you can see a global map of the cover. And those of you who've been in Africa, you know, you can't go to a farm without seeing some trees on the farm. Same with South Asia, Europe and North America. You see them more as boundaries, windbreaks, those kind of things. Central South America, you know, that in the tropics, obviously it's much easier to grow trees on the farms. So I'm focused on the dryland systems, but just to point out that, you know, we're in an age of climate change and carbon mitigation technologies and natural climate solutions, and forests have the most potential out of any land use, as you can see from this study. But as has been shown in some studies, it's not all simple adding trees to the landscape in agroforestry systems. And here you can see a diagram of different agroforestry systems, and you can see the variability. For example, silver pasture has 100-fold variation in how much above ground carbon it can store. And you can see the different systems. So there's a lot of variation in carbon accumulation. And so the type of agroforestry might be a better predictor than for above. Soil carbon sequestration is another whole story, and I had a student do some meta-analysis, and we did find that agroforestry is better for carbon sequestration, obviously, than agriculture, but not as good as forest or reforestation. So why drylands? Well, they account for about 40% of the world's land area, according to the UN. And we need better approaches to improve the livelihoods because not only in the drylands, but the world is getting hotter and drier. So my argument is we can learn from these drylands as other areas get hotter and drier for sustainable management. Now, this is a map of the 42%. And I would argue in the next slide that some of these orange yellow areas, I don't really think of as drylands, but we can have that discussion. So I've started a Substack, not that active, but I talk about, are we on the same page? So the way we measure drylands is through this aridity index, and it's basically precipitation over evapotranspiration. Now you can be in the tropics, obviously, and evapotranspiration can actually exceed precipitation because you know, it's so hot and a lot of the rainfall just evaporates. And so we have this table here, and we see areas of over 800 millimeters in the tropics that are so-called semi-humid or subhumid or humid, and they're classified as drylands. So I feel that, you know, those areas, although they do get intermittent rainfall, they might have a long rainfall season of 6 months and then no rainfall, they still get a lot of rain. And I'm more focused on these semi-arid areas where, you know, the 250 to 600 millimeters, so the semi-arid, arid areas, and that accounts for about 15% of the world's land area and about more than 1 billion people. So that's what I wanted to focus on, instead of thinking about these more subhumid areas. Now, when I started out on this, I was involved in a Nature Conservancy project to look at carbon in agroforestry systems, and we found, you know, over 1,600 geolocations where we could identify carbon data in these studies, and you can see what countries were most common. And then I had a student look at the semi-arid areas, the 600 millimeters or less, and we only found about 97 papers, and a lot of them are more recent, and you can see China and Sudan, the most common, Ziziphus and acacia, the most common species, wheat, sorghum, millet. So My first argument in neglect is the amount of work that's been done compared to, globally versus the drier areas. Then we can look at other data to verify this neglect. And the managing director of C4 ICRAF, the World Agroforestry Center, noted that the drylands have been largely neglected in restoration and climate agendas. And there was another paper that the majority of research in agroforestry is focused on tropical, humid, and subhumid environments. There is a strategy for resilient drylands, but I couldn't find out much information about what they're really doing. So why is this? To put it simply, when we compare the dry to the humid tropics, I like to just say it's because it's much easier to grow trees where there's a lot of rain. If you have rain, it's easy to grow trees. But if we dig deeper, we can argue that there's, these harsher environments are harder to do experiments. These benefits that a lot of are captured in these dry areas are not yield. And the funders like to see yield, they like to see production. And in these short funding cycles, without showing some actual metric, it's difficult to sell. So it makes it harder for investment in these areas, and then that reinforces a cycle of neglect. And it also reinforces this adaptation potential that's underutilized, because these other benefits like fodder, drought resistance, restoring soils are critical, and they're underutilized because of the neglect of funding, because they're not captured. They're very hard to capture. And one of my arguments is that the farmers in these areas continue to use agroforestry in quotes, not the agroforestry we might be thinking of, and again, without much formal support. So now let me just give you a sort of an overview of my take on agroforestry. It started in the 1970s as a science with ICRAF, the World Agroforestry Center, and a few other institutions. But why then? But there was a lot of concern about poverty. There was a lot of droughts in the Sahel, deforestation and climate change had come to the fore. And people were realizing that agriculture had just focused on crops, commercialization, extension, etc. Forestry sector had focused on, exclusion of farms and farmers from the forest, boundaries, state control of the resources. When in the past, the traditional people in these areas had used the forest just as much as they used their farms. And they were seen as a threat. And so this gap or divide between agriculture and forestry is why agroforestry still has a lot of interest and might seem new. It's been going on for 50 years, but obviously it is rooted in these traditional systems. And my argument, and I was, I said at 40 years, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in 1986, so that's 40 years ago, and working on agroforestry projects. And going back to these places, I don't see much has changed, and we can discuss that. So in the early days, it was the focus of agroforestry was on the plot and farm level, the crop tree soil interactions, a lot of studies, bringing in, fast-growing multi-purpose trees, thinking about complementarity versus competition with trees and crops and animals. And these were the metrics. There's something called the land equivalent ratio I won't get into that we were using. And from the 90s on, it evolved to this landscape thinking, livelihood thinking, where food and nutrition security was important, biodiversity, water regulation, carbon storage. And this is where the nexus kind of comes in. We're looking at the trade-offs and synergies among the land use functions. So from the plot level to sort of the landscape level. And that's how we sort of think about agroforestry these days. But I say agroforestry's future is still emerging, no doubt about it, but it's still blocked institutionally. And why? Because of this divide between agriculture and forestry. And neither of them are really considering trees outside forests on the farms. Even the agricultural agronomists sort of ignore the trees that we see on many of those farms I showed you on that map. Now, obviously, there is a lot of interest in the climate framing of agroforestry, but as a natural-based solution. But I argue that are the benefits really reaching the locals? Is there really a change or incremental benefits, both from the climate perspective and especially to the local people? There are some good innovations, and I think Trans-Sahara could be an example of, where programs support co-learning and participatory design. It's been around a long time. But others still push these standardized packages on the farmers. So agroforestry's multifunctionality, the fact that it has many different benefits, actually works against it, because it delivers all these other benefits, not just yield and production, but it's difficult to capture these, as I mentioned, in metrics. And yield, income, and carbon still dominate the evaluation of projects. And so what's not very easily managed is usually undervalued, and things like equity, resilience, those kind of buzzwords are very decisive, very hard to justify in projects. So what's promoted, funded, and governed, it's all about the metrics and numbers, and that's why agroforestry actually works against the multifunctional aspects of agroforestry actually work against it. So what I'm actually trying to get at is, adopting agroforestry practices. I've worked a lot on this. I've done a lot of studies, and there was this paper in 1999 by Pedro Sanchez talking about the promise of agroforestry, and one of them was these improved fallows. And then I wrote a paper a few years ago about why this promise wasn't being delivered, and I looked at improved fallows in southern Africa, specifically Zambia, but it can apply to other countries as well. And we assumed back in the 90s that, because these fast-growing fertilizer trees, farmers would provide an alternative to inorganic fertilizers, chemical fertilizers, and farmers would adopt them. Now, one of the arguments is adoption is very context specific. And there was an issue with soil replenishment, especially maize. It really degrades the soils. So what happened is ICRAF, the World Agroforestry Center, was active in Zambia, and they promoted these trees. They reached over 60,000 farmers. The farmers took the seed, right? They were given the seed. And as I argue in this paper, we don't see any of these fallow systems anymore. So what happened? Well, obviously the farmers had many other reasons for not keeping the trees. I mean, it could be fire, goats, land use, smaller parcels, just wanted something else on their land. But what we see today is Fadeherbia, and I know you guys have talked about this tree. It's excellent agroforestry seed, but farmers have been using this tree for centuries. They've known about its natural fertilizer benefits, and ICRAF wasn't promoting them. It was just there. Now, we do see some alley cropping with this fast-growing species, but it's mainly on these commercial farms for corporate social responsibility. So the smallholder farmer, we're not seeing any really uptake or scaling of agroforestry. So that's what's led me to my book project. And I mentioned at the beginning, work in Morocco on some of these dryland systems. I thought, let me expand it. Let me talk about why we have issues with adoption and how agroforestry has evolved and where we are and what we can maybe do for the future. And so I wanted to look at these dryland systems, how they've changed over time and how it affects the people living there. So to date, I've looked at 2 case studies in Morocco. I went to India in the natural Prosopis parklands of Western Rajasthan. I just came back from central Tanzania and Zimbabwe. And I'm hoping to get to Spain and Portugal. They have excellent systems with the silvopasture and some agriculture under the cork oak. Northeast Brazil has a new traditional system. And then the Sahelian Fadeherbia is an excellent case study. It's just difficult to get to the areas like Mali and Niger with security. So I'm thinking of Senegal. And then Marula is another good dryland area in northern Namibia. So this is the date palm scenario. Just to show you some pictures before I explain it a little more. You can see the dates. You can see the fodder crops here on the ground. In the top right, you can see it's a typical 3-layer system with the dates, the fruit trees, and the ground crops. On the right, you can see a degraded oasis system, and that's because of water. Simply put, and I'll explain that a little bit more. So you can see this area on the left where this is in Morocco, southwest Morocco, and you can see where the water system is still working and where it's not. This is the argon system, the argon tree, endemic to southwest Morocco. Southwest Morocco. The argon, I mean, the oasis was in southeast. So this tree provides, you probably all heard of argan oil. It's become internationally known as a cosmetic. You can see the seed here. It's also used as a culinary oil. And this is the typical landscape in the dry areas, but they grow barley underneath and they have their sheep and goats. Now, look at that picture and this picture of Western Rajasthan. When I went there and I showed them that picture of argon, the Indians were just saying, wow, that looks like our landscape. And so I took this picture and I showed the people in Morocco and they said, yeah, that looks like us. This is acacia. But the point is that there's a lot of commonalities across these dryland systems, especially in agroforestry practices in traditional ways, that I'd like to bring us together to discuss more. Just to show you an example, here's the prosopis tree that's very common on the farms in these dry areas, and they prune them every year for goats to feed on the leaves. Here in Zimbabwe last week, I saw this moringa tree, which is pruned for its fodder for the trees, and also moringa also has good nutritional value. So these are just some pictures from the Zimbabwe case study where you can see the trees on farms with the millet and the farmers collecting fruits from their trees. And so there's similar kinds of landscapes. Now, I can't go through all of the case studies in detail, and I'm still digesting everything. You know, these trips have been coming. But this is a good example of India where they use storage from the roof, and the water goes into these tanks. And on the right, you can see more of a traditional water harvesting system where you see they cleared the land around. So it's pretty hard surface, and the water runs in there. And this water keeps going throughout the dry season. And I was surprised that I hadn't seen it more in Africa and in Morocco, except for a few cases. Obviously, there's other constraints of why they don't do it. So let me just talk a little bit through about my narrative and the rationale of a couple of case studies. So in the oasis, I argue that for centuries, these oases have been managed traditionally, very complex systems, but they're reliable arrangements. So I mentioned the palm crop livestock integration. I showed you some pictures. The water distribution is very unique. It's an underground sort of spring system that comes down. I mean, you go to these areas in the middle of the desert and suddenly you come up on a green oasis, and it's all because of the water system that's very intricate, and the communities ruled that there was equitable irrigation, use of the water. So there was a lot of community-based management, and they had these enclosures, and they had grazing controls. So with colonialism and after, the state decided to privatize the water system. It broke down these traditional systems. They built large dams in the area around the oasis, which obviously affected the water systems, and they focused on irrigation. So in these Katera oasis systems, they started doing boreholes, wells, and so the aquifer, the groundwater collapsed, and that was the example I showed you of that oasis that had been very much degraded, because what was coming in around these oases was these modern pumps for borehole or solar irrigation, drip irrigation. Without governance, without the local involvement, a lot of outside people would come in and they would grow their crops. There's a big watermelon activity around this oasis. So they are using the groundwater at the expense of these traditional systems. So we see water scarcity, we see salinization, we see urban encroachment. Tourism is a big deal, and they all are in the water, use water. And because of this degradation of the traditional systems, we see a lot of migration which is actually a vicious cycle because as it gets drier, more and more people are leaving. There is now a focus on heritage and restoring these systems and tourism focus. Let's see how that goes. But again, we should be giving the local traditional systems the management rights to manage those kataras. Let me just mention a little bit about the argon story. So the argon tree, it's been sacred to these Berbers for centuries. It's central to their life. It was part of their food systems. The goats were integrated, and they were there was customary tenure, just like the oasis. They enforced restrictions on the use of the argon, and so it was able to prevent these bad events like droughts. They would rotate the goats away from the argon areas and move them into the more upland Atlas areas where there was better pastures. So what happened when the colonial and outsider people came in? They looked at these systems as degraded, overgrazed, and they blamed the goats, and there was desertification issues, and they said the nomads, were burning the forest and deforestation, and so they basically started to control these argon areas, and they weakened the communal customary control. The forestry came in, and they said we had to control as part of rational scientific forestry. They pushed for other species in these areas, and so it changed, right? That's the argument. The traditional system, the reliability professionals, the farmers, the herders, they were affected by these outside interventions. So there was more erosion, and livelihoods were diminished. So this is what the argon oil looks like. Today it's looked at as green gold. And so it's, the push to commercialization has really had an impact too on the traditional systems. It's designated as a UNESCO biosphere area. And, it's looked at as sustainable development symbol by outsiders with women's cooperatives and fair trade, but it's much deeper than that simple story. And then we have climate change. And in Morocco, they've had a lot of drought in the last decade. But this year they had some good rains, so we'll see what will come. But, droughts are going to come again. And so that's another factor. And so while these, the government sort of has this both, want to preserve the heritage, but also want to promote development, irrigation schemes, and export crops. So this over-commercialization pressure diminishes the other functions of the trees, right? If there's focus just on the oil. And the expansion of the dams and the groundwater level going down dramatically, and the expansion of oil cultivation has also affected those traditional argon areas. The migration out, because of the lack of jobs in these areas, with climate change, it creates a vicious cycle. As more droughts come, more people leave. There are some impressive projects going on to sort of reforest these areas, restore them, and create carbon markets. Let's see how those goes. I don't have a story about India, but I'll just mention there the government has provided quite a good amount of incentives, and Moroccans are doing too with drip irrigation and other systems, but they focus more on these external farmers, not the traditional systems. In India, they are providing resources and subsidies to the traditional farmers, but they are going more to cash crops because of that, which isn't a bad argument. They're getting drip irrigation, they're getting boreholes, but that's also severely impacting the groundwater. So, we got to keep those kind of trade-offs in mind. Let me just talk quickly about Binga in Zimbabwe, and you can see where that's located. It straddles the Kariba Dam. And what happened is it's a very dry area, although there's lots of water around it. It's just the rain shadow. And so the farmers there, the Tonga people, they traditionally farmed the riverbanks in the dry season because they could get that flooding from the Zambezi River before the dam was built. And they also had the low terraces and the higher fields. And the trees were, important not just for the functional benefits, but also they indicated rain and food security in times of drought and stuff. And so there was this sort of symbiotic synthesis of livestock, wildlife, which is a big issue there, the elephants and lions, and spirits shared the territory. So what happened is when the dam was built, they were forced out from the river and they moved up to the uplands, and they were forced to focus on maize, and they were forced to remove the trees that they had on these farms because the colonial government wanted sort of these monocultures. Traditionally, they had done sorghum and millet. And then they enclosed the wildlife and forests from around the communal lands. So conflicts emerged. There was that symbiosis, as I mentioned. They argued that the livestock they were using was overstocked in diseases, and so they forced the reduction of herds. And so they looked at this dryland area as a crisis, and the framing was the droughts. One of the systems of agroforestry they used was shifting cultivation, where fire was used to restore the soils, but the outsiders looked at that as destructive. So they looked at it as backwards, low productivity. They looked at the trees as timber or otherwise an unused resource, where, as I've shown you, it was very important to the Tongan culture for many purposes. So what happened is the local people, even with this outsider focus, continued to protect certain trees, manage those fallow systems with the fire. They continued to integrate livestock. And there's been this idea of, which I'll try and explain a little bit more, subsistence versus commercialization, but they wanted to solve this subsistence problem through tree commodification and value chains. So we see interest in these non-timber forest products and fruit trees and commercialization, which is potential. And they also push this climate smart agriculture with, more focused planting of trees, digging small holes to conserve the water around the seedlings and the seed. And they try to reintroduce indigenous trees like Fadeherbia. They also allowed the farmers to go back to their traditional system, or not allowed, they were doing it already, like the millet and sorghum, because maize just didn't do as well there. But one of the most intractable issues is this wildlife, the coexistence that they had in the past, and now the enclosures, and the elephants are causing trouble. Lions attack people sometimes, and it's not a good story. So the local people argue the problem is not us, it's because they lost their land because of the dam. They argue that the wildlife is part of their livelihood, it's not the state's property. And so they've continued to, as reliable professionals, as I argue, adopt the improved seeds that might come their way from the government, but this area has been very neglected. They are adopting some agroforestry species, but selectively, the way they want to do it, and soil conservation methods that they want to do. They've resisted these uniform packages that come from NGOs and donors, and species that have failed. So they know their systems. And they argue that diversification first, commercialization second, although the government is trying to push this commercialization. And then again, I can't stop talking about the wildlife because, without some kind of co-management that's failed for over 40 years, I don't know what's going to happen. So let me finish. I'm going to come to WEF Nexus. Don't worry, I'm going to finish off in a few minutes, but it's all about the water, right? I think I've come, most of these systems are rain-fed, but as we bring in irrigation, we're seeing sort of these trade-offs with groundwater use, and I think that's a big issue. But we can think about that in a WEF Nexus context. Solar irrigation has been promoted a lot, and drip irrigation, but a lot of and the commercialization aspect I've mentioned, but most of these people are still subsistence farmers, and I don't think that's going to change anytime. They might get some income from these tree products. And they do sell some surplus grain, but a lot of the times they just want to store it in case there's a drought the next year. And the institutions and politics, I think that's the key. A lot of these areas I've looked at have been neglected, and I'm seeing that where the government are providing subsidies, there is more livelihood benefits, but it's you got to be careful because these people have subsisted on these areas, and when you push some of these subsidies, they might have negative impacts. Some of the questions I'd like to think about is do we really understand the structure there? In some of these areas, I just couldn't get a handle on there's local communal governments, there's the chiefs, there's the administrative governments. Who makes the decisions? Who are the farmers of today, and where does Nexus fit in? And I'm coming to that in a minute. But I think there's 3 trajectories we can think about. Okay, we can do this planting, this regeneration, like the argon systems they're trying to restore by planting argon. We can think about commodities and the carbon landscape, so these multi-purpose trees and the value chains. Or we can think of a third path, which is this cultural resilience network that I've talked about that has evolved and been changed. And how do we bring back path 3 is my question. Or maybe there's a combination of these 3 paths. So let me just say a few words of Nexus. I know I haven't done a good job of trying to integrate it into agroforestry. I think the idea of Nexus is these trade-offs. And, in agroforestry, there's a trade-off between agriculture, livestock, and forestry. And as you've seen, forestry and agriculture are still in silos, and the livestock is still in a silo. So we have the same issues of trade-offs. But I think I was involved in some work on operationalization in 2021, and I don't think anything's really changed. We're still not seeing a lot of operationalization of Nexus. A lot of these models are sort of high scale, sort of country level or sub-catchment level, and they don't really look at the local areas, or they're not very well suited to looking at these multiple trade-offs, especially of the 3 sectors. Scale is another issue that's related to the models. What scale do we look at? Nexus operates at all different scales. I still think in most of the papers, I see very little social science. Obviously, one of the limitations is the lack of availability on this data. It's very, very complex to really get a good handle using a WEF Nexus approach. We talk about stakeholder involvement bottom up, but who is really making these decisions in these Nexus projects? And then I think the key on Nexus is telling the science to policy, and policymakers want easy to implement solutions, and sometimes the results of our analysis are pretty complex. So, we do these models and we look at Nexus, and the inputs go in and it all looks good, but we don't really focus on the societal benefits or the outcomes, which I think we need to do more of. So as Leah mentioned at the beginning, this is one of our projects trying to build networks of Nexus with Africa and EU. We worked with Cost Action, NexusNet, and we have these collaborative learning schools I can talk more about. And so where is Nexus going? I mean, now we've got this resource Nexus, and you can look at this diagram, and where do you see forests? Why is that missing? But I think Nexus is a great tool for conceptualizing and discourse, but practically I still have some concerns about it. But I think it's important for Trans-Sahara and to think about how it can be implemented into agroforestry projects, and I'd like to be thinking about that as well. So it's all about policy and governance. This is my last slide. You can see, hopefully from what I showed, that these traditional systems are models of good management. So we should recognize these farmers. They're managing these complex systems. They've done their best. They've dealt with droughts for millennia. So we should support and reward them for their adaptations and let them govern and let the communities blend tradition and innovation as the innovations come their way that they want to adopt. So we need to design coherent incentives or subsidies, as I was mentioning earlier. I can go into more of that. And measure success by, look, they've survived droughts. They know how to manage their herds and adjust their seasonal activities when droughts occur. And not just look at it as tree counts. And so going back to this adoption question, where we want them to adopt trees or farmer managed natural regeneration, it's a process of trial learning and reappropriation, not, either they adopt it or not. And this non-adoption is a rational strategy. So they know what they want to adopt, and don't force them with these technologies, or you'll see what happened, like I showed you in Zambia, where there's nothing left after 5 years when the project ends. So we should support them in their drives to experiment and adopt technologies, not prescribe these fixed technologies. And our role as scientists or academics or practitioners should be to clarify these trade-offs, support these learning loops, the feedbacks, and help negotiate solutions. For example, the wildlife issue in Zimbabwe. It's all related to their farming systems. So long-term resilience rather than short-term yield is the mantra. And again, I've got these Substacks, and one of them I wrote was, do farmers even want agroforestry? The reason being, I talk to farmers and they don't need more trees. They say, we got our trees on our farm. Some of them are naturally regenerating. Acacia comes back very fast. And so the question is, how many more trees do we want these farmers to actually grow? Obviously, we want the carbon benefits, but we have to be careful about what they want. So we really need to ask them what they want on their land. So with that, I'm going to stop and thank you for your time. And I think we still have a good 15 minutes for questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Jacobson, for your really exciting, insightful talk. It's just incredible to see all the different regions that you worked in, all these different agroforestry systems, and all the experiences that you've collected there. So I'm really happy that we're connecting at this point in time and giving us the opportunity to learn from you. So thank you very much. And I have a whole bunch of questions that I would like to raise. But what typically happens in these talks is that the moderator monopolizes the questions, and then we run out of time, and then we still have a lot of questions left. So what I would like to do today is to open the floor directly to our audience. So I think that you can either just unmute yourself, raise your hand, or put questions in the chat. All these options are possible. I also want to specifically call on our members of the consortium of Trans-Sahara who are here. So I can see Eleanor and Nikolaus are here, Asane, and Ekaterina, for example. I'm sorry if I missed anybody, to please put any questions that you may have to Professor Jacobson. So would anyone like to start? And thank you, Nikolaus. I see your hand raised. So please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the talk. Very insightful and a good overview. And I copied a lot of the sources. Thank you for that already. I mean, the motivation for the people on site might be also different. So some people might say, well, I want this kind of innovation, and others say, probably we don't need it. How do you work with that? Because there are a lot of opinions and everybody's right, and sometimes no one is right. So yeah, that's the question.
Yeah, that's the $1 million question is, it's obviously understanding what the farmers want to begin with before we try and introduce a package or some technology or innovation. I mean, they are eager to drip irrigation, they'd love to have it, and some governments provided subsidies, as I mentioned, some are totally neglected. And, the storage system, I would just go about it where you really need to understand what they want to begin with. I mean, as simple as that, and be wary of just pushing things on them. I mean, I know I sound like a broken record, but we need to get to the context specificity of these systems and there's no, one shoe fits all.
Okay, thanks a lot. Additionally, I had the fortune to also be to the southern parts of Morocco and see the argan trees. And also there were some initiatives to get some varieties or to make basically a breeding program. Are you also working with this kind of, I mean, it is going from wild trees into fruit trees, basically. What's your opinion about that? And then it's all, thank you all.
Yeah, no, it's going on. There's a lot of work. In fact, one of my concerns with the whole argan culture is, and they are planting improved varieties and looking for good trees that, but the argan area is huge. It's 1 million hectares almost. And so from the north to the south, there's very different systems and soils. And so when you talk about improved varieties, you have to think about that. But one thing, I've noticed the Moroccans is they're very focused on the biophysical aspects, like you say, the breeding, and there needs to be more on the social farmer side of things. And hopefully I'm trying to work with them on that. So, but yeah, I'm all for improved breeding and getting more trees in the ground, but the farmers have to want them.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Great. I see Eleanor's hand raised.
Hi, thank you very much, Professor Jacobson, for the really interesting talk. I think it was really nice at the end how you summarized how we should let communities blend tradition and innovation, and then as scientists, it's more about how can we help clarify those trade-offs. And I think that's some of the things we're trying to do in the project. I had a couple of questions. First of all, all the case studies you mentioned and how there can be learning between very different regions of the world. And even within Trans-Sahara, the North African landscapes are so different to Ghana or Ethiopia or the Sahelian landscapes. So I guess is there a trade-off between really delving into a context-specific area and having really high quality data, for example, and then creating maybe models or frameworks that can be flexible and facilitate that learning?
Yeah. No, I thank you for that comment, because I agree with you. It's hard to generalize across these different landscapes. I mean, they all have the same common issue, which is water, right, and low rainfall. And that's what I want to hinge on. And what I'd like to do with these case studies, and the co-authors are helping me with them in the countries, is to bring you all together. I think Trans-Sahara could be a good partner in this, and have some workshops or even, a conference where we look at each other. I mean, I was amazed when I went to India and saw the same species I see in Africa, the acacias and the prosopis, and they used to be linked, right? It's partly because the continents were connected, but also because of trade and the technologies that the local people use. I think there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from each other. So, I'm more on the local specific side of things, but I don't want to say we shouldn't be doing the high level modeling approaches that you're thinking of, Eleanor.
Yeah, thank you. I guess the specific task we're working on is to create a multi-criteria decision analysis tool, but maybe focusing first on specific case studies. So I'm looking at Ethiopia at the moment, but also maybe make it flexible with different data inputs in different living lab areas. So
yeah, that sounds very useful. Yeah. And yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Perfect. Thank you, Eleanor. Right, I think Taiwo was next, and then Asane.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Mike, for this presentation. However, I have a question specifically for the Sahel region, Africa. We talked about agroforestry, but I am of the opinion that the use of firewood production versus crop farming or the expansion of the forest at the expense of grasslanding might be a conflict as time goes on in the Sahel region, especially the issue of water, and it might also be difficult to penetrate into this region because of the insurgency. The insecurity currently going on. What do you think can be a probable solution? Even it might not work now, but long-term solution that can work for the future. Thank you.
No, you guys are throwing out some big questions. Yeah, well, the security issue has to be dealt with. But if I went to Niger or Mali now or northern Nigeria, I mean, you would see the farmers managing their systems sustainably as well as they can, subsistence-wise, if they had some surplus. So I think we want to learn from that. I mean, there's the Great Green Wall Initiative going on. I mean, it's severely underfunded, and I've heard a lot of issues about community engagement. And that's a problem because I think it's more top down. The UN want to see trees and they're not thinking about the enclosures. And you're right about the encroachment of the forest for grazing and then the forestry people trying to keep them out. I think it really comes down to allowing and providing incentives and subsidies for the local people to manage the land as they best think. I mean, that's all I can say without more specifics of what area you're talking about, Taiwo.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, Asane, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, dear Prof. Thank you, Daphne, for this opportunity. Congratulations, Prof, for this nice presentation of learning for us. I had just a couple of comment on the question you asked at the end. What do farmers like? Okay, I think it's a very key, it's a very exciting question because most of the time my thought is that sometime when it comes to analyzing agroforestry, we mainly focus on the positive aspect of agroforestry in the environment. Okay, how is this going to stock greenhouse gases? How is this going to, improve the environment? But most of the time, we do not think about how it affects the farmers. I think that at the end of the day, what the farmer like is mainly just increasing their revenue. So when it comes to analyzing agroforestry, we must I think ask the question about does agroforestry really create enough revenues? Okay, is this something that can allow the farmers to get a return back? Okay, because they are I think rational agent, and as rational they just want to invest and get more than what they have invested. And I think that for agroforestry, I have not seen the number of 94 studies that you have seen, but I'm sure that most of them did not address that question. And I think that for us as researchers, we need, I think, to address the economical aspect. Okay, I don't know the rentability of agroforestry from the farmer's point of view. Yeah. Okay, that was my comment. I don't know, maybe in your readings, what is where do you place economical aspect of agroforestry, in your thinkings? That is a question, I think.
Yeah, no, that's a great question because what I've been arguing is the multifunctional aspects of these trees on farms. But you're right. I mean, if the farmers are going to add trees, they want to have the add is the word. They already have legacy trees and trees. So it's the additional trees that we want to see from the carbon perspective or the biodiversity perspective, or, you know, just having more trees, is the question of adding more trees. And I don't see a lot of farmers wanting to add unless they have that economic benefit, like a fruit tree. But we've been working for 50 years on non-timber forest product markets, you know, for some of these indigenous species. And where has that gotten us? You know, and so I think that I agree with you. I think it's all about the economics, and that's the trade-offs that I think would be good from the perspective of the Trans-Sahara project, is to be thinking of, you know, crops versus trees versus livestock, and how to manage that complex system in a WEFI Nexus framework. But it's this additionality of trees that we think of agroforestry. You know, I don't know how many of you in your mind think of rows of trees, right? Or windbreaks, or alley crops, or, you know, rows in the pasture, or, you know, but that's not the way the farmers think about it. And so we need to, you know, when we say agroforestry, we need to understand that the farmers don't think the same way we do. So, but I agree, we've got to make it an economic proposition, and how we do that, we've tried for a long time.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, are there any other questions? Would anyone else like to raise anything? I don't see any. Yes, here we have one more. Manuel, please go ahead. And then the question is, if we can take 5 or maybe 8 more minutes from your time, Professor Jacobson, that would be great. Thank you. All right, Manuel, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, thank you, Michael, for your presentation. I am working at the University of Extremadura in southwestern Spain, so I hope to see you in a few weeks. I think you are coming here, right?
Right.
Yeah.
With Victor.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we'll make sure we will organize a seminar for you, so you can give us a seminar. Okay, my question is this. You have been going through, I mean, you have been going back to the places where you work earlier, I mean, like 30 or 40 years ago. Okay, so I wanted to ask you, what changes have you seen, environmental and social changes, in the places where you have worked first on agroforestry?
Yes, good. I mean, the short answer is not much. I mean, I went back after Peace Corps with my family 20 years afterwards, and there was we did an agroforestry nursery in Lesotho, and there was nothing left. In fact, the field where the nursery was had become a home garden for the chief. And I showed you the evidence in Zambia, and I think that, you know, in these really subsistence, neglected areas of drylands, and I argue it's neglected, is the you know, it's just like a picture of history. You know, other people can show changes. The main change I can tell is the cell phone. I mean, that's the one thing, and maybe some implements. I mean, for example, you know, some you know, boreholes bring in diesel pumps. You know, even some areas, you know, they still use hose and even oxen to plow. And that's a technology, you know, adding oxen. So to be honest, you know, in some of these really dry rural areas that the government's neglected, I haven't seen much change, to be honest.
Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So I don't see any more hands raised. That means that now I can monopolize the questions.
Please.
I have several questions, but maybe the first one is, because we're looking for parallels to Trans-Sahara, whether in all the projects that you've looked at, and there are so many, what kind of water management approaches or technologies that you came across can you recommend to Trans-Sahara for uptake? So you mentioned this digging of holes rather than plowing, for example. And I was wondering if you are aware of any, Well, projects that use managed aquifer recharge as well as an opportunity, and how that was handled, if so, or any publications that look at that too.
Yeah, the aquifer recharge, I'm not too familiar with how that works. On the water harvesting, I mean, yeah, these pits are being promoted as conservation agriculture, but you know, you have to look at the soils and you have to look at the context of the farmers. You know, some of them want to use it, so it's a lot of labor. I mean, other systems I've seen are, you know, the half moon. I've seen the furrows. So when it rains, the water, you know, and they plant they mound up the crops, so the water runs between the rows. But you know, I can't generalize unless seeing the area where your living labs are, you know. But I think that's the key, is to see what the farmers are doing. And that's where I think learning from other areas is good. I think that water storage system that the Indians are doing with those underground tanks is really good. You know, the problem in some of these African communities is they still use thatch, so they don't have they can't afford the zinc or whatever roofs to do that. And that's where the government could come in and really make a big difference. And you know, and then you have the extremes. In the dry area, you know, they really have to go down to the river and then dig a hole to get to the groundwater in the middle of the river, you know, and that's their water supply. And then for other things I've seen are, for example, you know, the government would come in and do a borehole, but the people don't use it. Why? Because they don't like the taste, or it has a sulfur smell or something like that, you know. So there's all these nuances, and but you know, one of the things people are promoting these technologies, and I asked, you know, if they're so good, why haven't the farmers used them before? You know, and that's one of the questions. And maybe it's just they didn't know about it before, which is perfectly legitimate. But you know, I'd like to see in these dry areas why they haven't done it, and that's where I think we need to go back and look at how they've done it in the past.
Yeah.
And adapt.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you. Now we do have another question in the chat as well. So let me just quickly see what it says there. In Binga, you said that they are surrounded with water. What can be done to improve the security in line with the nexus? Not sure what is meant by in line. In line with the nexus. Maybe it's two words. Yeah, sorry.
Okay, so those are two questions. Yeah, they're surrounded by water. They've got the Zambezi River, and which now is Lake Kariba, and they've got rivers coming into it around them. And so their water, although it dries up, you know, is not far from them. And but it is an interesting nexus question. I mean, the problem with you know, is the energy side of things. I mean, what is the energy side of the story? You know, it's mostly labor, right? There's no sort of outside energy being used other than animals, maybe oxen or the labor. And now obviously the food systems, you know, it's like a wealth of water and not available is the story in Binga, really. And so as I saw in the Argonne areas and some of Morocco, they are transporting water multiple kilometers through pipes to these villages. So that's an example where you know, the water can be introduced into these villages. I told you some of the trade-offs with using the water, whether they actually want these new water sources. But yeah, and then how does that use of the water affect their farming systems? These are all good questions to consider. And yeah, that's what keeps it interesting.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So I think we should wrap up because we're already over our time. But I like the idea very much that of having maybe a joint workshop or something. I know that you're also planning a book about agroforestry systems. And of course, Trans-Sahara would be very excited to talk more about that. So Leah, maybe we keep that in mind for the next few weeks, that we try and reach out to Professor Jacobson to get something organized, and we see what the options are for that from his side.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
That leaves me just to thank you very much, Professor Jacobson, for taking the time to give us an expert talk in Trans-Sahara. This was super valuable for us, and we look forward to the further exchanges with you on this topic.
Well, thank you both, Leah and Daphne. It was great. I enjoy it, and I look forward to continuing collaboration.
Thank you so much for joining us.
All right. Have a good day.
Thank you very much. Thank you also, Leah, for organizing everything so well. And thank you to our great audience and the good questions. All the best. Bye-bye.
All right.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.